Karl Marx in Das Kapital refers to the vampire often as a metaphor for the relationship between capital and labour. That capital is like a vampire, and the more vitality it takes from labour, the more it actually gets powerful.
So you serve the lords. What do the lords do for you?
They protect us from the wasting.
It's about blood, but it's also about power. And so in the Doctor Who story, when you've got this feudal king and queen lording it over the peasants in their Gothic castle in a kind of rerun of the Middle Ages, it's a very classic sort of vampiric relationship between the haves and the have-nots. The vampire really came onto the radar of the chattering classes in the 18th century when there were a series of apparent epidemics of vampirism in Eastern Europe and Turkey and Greece, where people started resurrecting, it seems. The vampire of the 18th century epidemics was an agricultural labourer with a red face, a breath problem, a big mouth, and he was liable to bite sheep and cows as often as his relatives. This is a rural agricultural phenomenon. When he gets into literature, he or she, the vampire becomes an aristocrat. And the reason for that is quite complicated, but it's to do with the public image of British aristocrats in Europe, which was roughly similar to the image of football hooligans today.
You killed him. The blood of the dead is stale and flat. I must feed on the living.
Basically, you know, the rules of the game are set down. It's an aristocrat. You stop them by putting a wooden stake through the heart, which comes, I think, from suicides who in the 18th century would be buried at crossroads with a stake through their heart to prevent them coming back. Hammer films in the 1950s, the horror equivalent of the seaside postcard with buxom wenches serving foaming mead behind the bar. That's part of this as well. But State of Decay happens at a moment when you know, the myth is about to regenerate in new forms. And I do find it interesting because it is trying to be a traditional vampire story. The count in the castle, the peasants below, the forest, the bats. But it's also computers of a rather clunky kind, which is quite amusing too, with punch cards and things. And in particular, the Gothic castle transposing into a spaceship, which itself turns into a metal stake, which goes into... the special effects may be a bit clunky, but it's quite an interesting idea that a castle becomes a spaceship, becomes the agent of destruction. What was going on when State of Decay was shown on television were two things really within the vampire myth. One of them is to try and get vampires away from Gothic castles and forests and Eastern Europe and Transylvania and put them in a modern setting. Are vampires still frightening when the devil's in the central heating unit? You know, that kind of thing. Or do you need the Gothic castle and the forest? What's interesting about the Doctor Who series is that you've got both. You've got the Gothic castle, but it turns out to be a modern spaceship.
If you need anything, there are guards outside the door. Many guards.
There's another final aspect of the vampire that I felt quite strongly when looking at the Doctor Who series, and that's the campery of it. Bram Stoker belonged to the theatrical world of late Victorian England. He was Henry Irving, the actor's manager. And there was a kind of very theatrical, sort of flamboyant, slightly camp late 19th century aspect of Dracula as well. And as I was looking at the slight amateur dramatics of the Doctor Who thing, of the King and Queen, all this, I thought, yeah, maybe there's a bit of that in there as well. What you might call the camp vampire is an underrated aspect of this. You can imagine them singing My Way. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention, you know. It's been one of the most enduring horror myths of all time. I don't think vampires are frightening anymore. I think they're more sort of Gothic romance, in a way, that we know the rules so well, we know the vampire story so well, there's something almost camp about vampires, except I've discovered to vegetarians.